After almost 10 years of rumours, reboots, and it's finally happening headlines, Star Trek 4 is gone. Paramount didn't even make a big deal out of it. They just quietly confirmed what most fans had already figured out. They're moving on from Chris Pine and the whole Kelvin era crew. It's kind of wild when you think about how much hope this series had at the start. The 2009 reboot brought new life to Star Trek and eventually made it cool again for a whole new generation. But after a few sequels, a tragic loss in the cast and a pile of expensive projects that went nowhere, the energy around it, well, it started to fade. By 2025, the new people running Paramount decided to start over. A fresh Star Trek movie direction. New everything. But the truth is, that decision wasn't about creativity. It came down to money, risk, and corporate control. Behind all the excitement, the franchise had quickly turned into a headache. And here's the dark truth on why Star Trek 4 was cancelled. Which is a nightmare. The money problem. Let's take a look at that first. When people talk about why Star Trek 4 fell apart, they usually blame bad timing or creative confusion. But the real problem was money. And a lot of it. After Star Trek Beyond hit theatres in 2016, the numbers just didn't add up anymore. The film cost around $190 million to make and brought in only about $343 million worldwide. Now that sounds decent on paper, but after marketing costs and profit splits, Paramount barely broke even. For a studio that's trying to build another billion-dollar franchise, that was a warning sign. Then came the cast salaries. By that point, everyone involved had blown up into huge names. Chris Pine was headlining blockbusters, Zoe Saldana was juggling Avatar and Guardians of the Galaxy films, and Carl Urban was deep into The Boys. Getting all of them back together wasn't cheap, and Paramount wasn't willing to pay Marvel-level money for a series that had already peaked at the box office. Fans on Reddit called it out years ago, saying the studio didn't want to spend money bringing back Hemsworth for the rumoured time travel storyline, and you know what? They were right. The economics just stopped making sense. Paramount's focus had shifted towards streaming, pouring more money into Paramount Plus and its TV shows. That meant film budgets had to shrink. Internally, executives started talking about right-sizing Star Trek, keeping it alive but within a smaller box office ceiling. That phrase basically meant one thing: no more big ensemble space epics with giant effects and expensive actors. Oh well, but behind the scenes, it also didn't help that every director and writer who came on board brought a different vision, which wasted both time and money. You know, at one point, Quentin Tarantino's pitch for an R-rated Trek movie was seriously discussed, while other teams worked on more traditional sequels, all burning through development budgets with no results. So, by the time Skydance took over Paramount in 2025, the math was impossible to ignore. Continuing the Kelvin timeline wasn't financially smart, no matter how much fans love the cast. The studio wanted something new and cheaper to make, easier to market, and flexible enough to tie into their growing streaming plans. So Star Trek 4 didn't die because audiences stopped caring. It died because Hollywood accountants decided exploration wasn't worth the risk anymore. So let's look at the rise of the Kelvin timeline. When J.J. Abrams rebooted Star Trek in 2009, it felt like lightning in a bottle. The casting was perfect, wasn't it? Chris Pine brought swagger, Zachary Quinto gave Spock depth, and Carl Urban practically channeled DeForest Kelley as McCoy. Even die-hard Trekkies admitted it had energy the series hadn't seen in decades. It wasn't just another reboot, it was a fresh universe, the Kelvin timeline, that made Star Trek feel big again. The sequel, Into Darkness, came in 2013 and pushed the action even harder, though not everyone agreed with Abrams' take on Khan. Then Beyond in 2016 tried to steer things back toward classic Star Trek ideals, like teamwork, exploration, moral stakes, and you know what? Fans actually loved it. The problem was, not enough people showed up to see it. The box office dip hit hard, and then tragedy struck. Anton Yelchin, who played Chekhov, died in a freak accident just before Beyond's release. J.J. Abrams said the role would never be recast, and that loss hung over everything afterwards. The cast wanted to keep going, but the spark was fading. The Kelvin timeline had proved that Star Trek could still work, but just not in the way Paramount expected. So now let's look at the false starts and broken promises. After Beyond, the path to Star Trek 4 turned into a maze of announcements that led nowhere. The studio kept trying to bring the crew back together, but every version of the movie collapsed before cameras could even roll. One idea would have reunited Chris Pine with Chris Hemsworth for a time travel story between father and son. Now that fell apart after contract talks went bad. Then came a completely different pitch, Quentin Tarantino's R-rated take on Star Trek, which sounded wild but never made it past the early draft stage, unfortunately for some. Later, Fargo creator Noah Hawley was set to direct his own version until the studio suddenly scrapped it, deciding it was too different. By 2022, Paramount brought in WandaVision director Matt Shakman to restart everything again, only for him to leave for Fantastic Four. The last hope came in 2024 when writer Steve Yockey was hired to give the project one final try. Even then, Chris Pine said he hadn't seen a single page of the script. Each attempt drained more faith, more time and more money. And what was supposed to be the franchise's big return slowly became Hollywood's longest running sci-fi waiting game. So let's look at the leadership shift that finally killed it. Everything changed once Skydance officially took over Paramount in 2025. The new boss, David Ellison, came in with a very clear plan. Cut what wasn't working, double down on what was. Within months, Star Trek IV was gone from the schedule. Variety's report made it official. The studio wanted a fresh Star Trek movie, and that meant moving on from Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, and everyone tied to the J.J. Abrams reboot. It wasn't personal, it was business. Ellison's team was focused on proven moneymakers like Top Gun and Days of Thunder, both getting new sequels with Tom Cruise. The Kelvin crew didn't fit into that future. Instead, Paramount pivoted towards something new, a Star Trek origin film being developed by Andor director Toby Haynes and writer Seth Grahame-Smith. Now that project, according to insiders, would serve as a kind of reboot for the entire timeline, smaller in scope but built to tie in with Paramount's streaming plans. In other words, Star Trek IV wasn't cancelled because it failed, it was replaced. The studio didn't want to patch up an old ship, it wanted to build a new one from scratch, and that meant leaving the Kelvin era behind. So what comes next for the fresh Trek era? Paramount isn't abandoning Star Trek entirely, it's just steering the ship in a new direction. The studio's next phase focuses on smaller, tighter projects that connect directly to its streaming universe. Instead of billion-dollar spectacles, they're chasing stories that feel more grounded and flexible. The upcoming Starfleet Academy series, set to premiere in 2026, is a big part of that plan. It's being shaped as the franchise's new flagship, targeting younger viewers and built for the Paramount Plus audience that's already hooked on shows like Strange New Worlds. On the film side, Paramount and Skydance are working on what insiders call a Star Trek origin movie. It's being developed by Andor director Toby Haynes and writer Seth Grahame-Smith, so we can expect a tone closer to character-driven sci-fi than simple blockbuster action. The idea is to tell a story that resets the universe without erasing what came before, giving both old fans and newcomers a fresh starting point. It is a big gamble, but after nearly 2 decades of trying to turn Star Trek into a cinematic franchise on Marvel's scale, Paramount seems ready to pull back and return to something smaller, something that feels more like Star Trek again. In the end, Star Trek IV didn't collapse overnight. It faded out slowly, lost in years of shifting priorities, expensive ambitions, and a studio that couldn't decide what kind of future it wanted for the franchise. The Kelvin timeline gave fans incredible performances, sharp storytelling, and a modern energy that made Star Trek exciting again. But behind all that success, the numbers stopped working, and the business side took over the bridge. Now the crew that brought those characters to life has moved on. Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, Zoe Saldana, Carl Urban. They all helped define a new generation of Trek. Fans still revisit those movies, still quote the lines, still talk about Star Trek IV and what it could have been, and maybe that's why this version of the franchise will always matter. It gave Star Trek heart again, even if it couldn't keep its footing in Hollywood's constant reshuffling. So maybe it's fitting that this chapter ends not with an explosion, but with quiet. The Enterprise sails off one last time, the lights dim and the screen fades to black, because, in true Star Trek fashion, endings aren't really endings. They're just the beginning of something new waiting to launch. And that's a wrap for this video. I'll see you in the next one, and don't forget, live long and prosper. See ya, bye!